Great, thank you so much. It's delightful to be here tonight. So my name's Emily Briggs. I'm the Deputy Director General and I look after climate and sustainability at the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, which is a WA government agency. So tonight, I'm going to really home in on climate and nature. So there's obviously SDGs related to climate and nature, which we'll talk about soon. But climate and nature underpin so many more than just the boxes where you see them sitting. Climate and nature really underpin all life on our planet. So tonight, I'm going to start by giving you a bit of a scary picture, but don't worry, it does get better. I'll talk a bit about what we're doing in government to tackle some of these issues, and then I'm going to end on what are the things that give me hope and how I think we can start to turn things around. It starts grim. So, sadly, the world currently faces two environmental crises. We are very much in the midst of a climate and a biodiversity crisis. All you need to do right now is turn on the news and you can see the climate crisis. We've got bushfires, we've got 1 in 100 year floods happening at terrifying frequency. We've got all of these growing natural disasters. Climate change is real and climate change is here. We've also, in recent years, I think started to have growing understanding that we are also in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. So we are destroying and losing nature at an unprecedented rate. The rate of background extinction at the moment is estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times more than normal throughout history. So earlier this year, we heard from the IPCC. I'm sure many of you in the room are very familiar with the IPCC. They're sort of the most credible, largest scientific body on climate science in the world. And then the IPCC delivered a pretty stark warning. So the pace and scale of climate action to date is insufficient to tackle climate change. So if we stack up all of the global commitments that we have around the world, we're on track for somewhere between 3.2 and 3.5 degrees of global warming. As a reminder, the IPCC have indicated that we need to keep limits below 2 degrees to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So you can see, tracking for 3.2 to 3.5, we are well in the realm of catastrophic impacts. Oh, it's very grim, isn't it? It will get perkier. So we are also in the midst of a biodiversity emergency. So as I said, we are destroying nature at an unprecedented rate. And this is not just a global problem. This is happening in our own backyard. It's happening here in Australia. So Australia has actually the highest rate of mammalian extinction in the world. 35% of the world's mammals that have gone extinct has been here in Australia. Just last week, the scientific advisory body on species advised in Australia that 41 more species should be added to the critically endangered list. And the sad fact is, species don't come off that list when they're recovered. Species come off that list when they become extinct. So it's happening here. This must be the most used quote of the evening. So I think we're all pretty clear now that we're not on track with the SDGs. And one of the big challenges around this is finance. We simply do not have the volumes of finance that we need flowing in across all of our SDGs. So not just across climate and nature related, but across all of the SDGs. At the end of the day, we know that a lot of our challenges come back to flow of finance. Also just remind that thinking about nature and environment, it's not a luxury, it's essential because as I said before, it underpins all life on Earth. As the Australian State of the Environment report that came out last year so clearly noted, we know that human well-being is very closely linked to nature and environment. And this is something that has been, you know, a huge part of the longest running culture on Earth. The Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders have had this clear connection for so long. So, what are we going to do? We're absolutely not going to solve the twin crisis through business as usual. In fact, business as usual is what got us here. What we're going to need is innovative new approaches, and we are going to need clever people like all of you here in the room. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my role at government and what government's doing in this space. So, again, you're probably all very familiar with this slide from this evening. We've got the 17 SDGs. I've called out a handful there where it's probably really obvious what government and what my department's relationship is. Things around clean water and sanitation, climate action, life on land. But as I said, we know that climate and nature cut across so many of these SDGs. So the department that I work for, Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, has whole of government responsibility, so for whole of Western Australian policy on nature, climate, circular economy, and water. So how do I get to spend my day? So I spend my day thinking about what we can do to help WA start to transition towards a net zero, nature positive, circular economy with a really solid, robust water security strategy. Obviously an enormous amount happening at government. So how do we get out of this crisis? So one of the key ideas that I've been thinking about, and I'll keep talking about more tonight, is we need to change the way we think about and value nature and the environment. And Celia did a terrific presentation on this before, paving the way, thinking about what we value and how we value things. But to date, nature has largely not been valued. It's just been valued as an input into production. We haven't been valuing its contribution to society, its more intrinsic values, what it brings to us in terms of cultural, societal, health benefits. So at the department where I work, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this and how we can start to embed and consider some of those other environmental values. A big piece, and this is where we have a lot more work to do, is also thinking about how we can learn more from our First Nations custodians and how we can start to bring those values into our conversations about the value of nature and the environment. So, we're talking about two crises, climate and nature. We've talked quite a lot about climate tonight, so I'm going to home in on the nature crisis. So last year, I'm sure many of you followed this, we had a very historic agreement at COP15, which is the Global Biodiversity Conference. So it's kind of like the climate for COP, but it's the partner COP for biodiversity. It was a long time coming, but we got global agreement, broadly, around a goal of halting and beginning to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. So what does that actually mean? So as you can see with this pretty picture up here, what that means is right now we know that we are destroying. So what we need to do is start to slow and halt destruction, and then we need to bend the curve and we need to start restoring and recovering nature. Sounds easy. You'll probably also see a new term up on it's a term that's been kicking around probably about the last 18, 24 months around nature positive. So we talked a lot around the climate terms in the last couple of presentations, but this is the language that's sort of shaping up in the nature space. So it's estimated that over half of global GDP is either medium or highly dependent on nature. So that means over $44 trillion a year of the global economy is dependent on nature. So sounds like it makes pretty good economic sense to look after the economy, after nature. But sadly, what we know is that to date, restoration and recovery of nature has largely been funded by the public purse or by philanthropy. It's not something that's traditionally seen as investable. It's also not something that's been traditionally valued. But this is where I get quite hopeful. So over sort of the last 3 or 4 years, there's been this growing understanding that nature underpins the global economy. Up on the screen, I've got a few of the kind of landmark reports that have come out, and these have helpfully really captured the attention of people like investors and sovereign wealth funds and regulators and people that can start to control and shift financial flows. But essentially what we've learned is that nature has economic value, but what that also means is it presents economic risk. And I know many of you here work in business. Companies are willing to spend and invest money when it reduces your exposure to risk. So if you are, say, a sneaker manufacturer and you are highly dependent on rubber for the production of your products, when you start to dig around and get into the surface and start to really understand what are the risks around your sourcing strategy for rubber, you can start to uncover some pretty scary nature risks. So it might be that you source from a particular part of the world where it's quite likely there's going to be changing regulations or changing sort of expectations in the area where you may not be able to take that rubber for much longer. You might also uncover things such as declining soil health or declining water sources, which are going to impact your ability to continue to source your rubber. And this is good news, because once people start to uncover and identify these risks, that is when finance starts to flow, because you have the credible business case to start to invest and make changes, start to protect and restore the nature that you now realize your business depends on. So this is where I get quite hopeful. As I said, there is some hope. There are some levers for change. So I've worked in this space for a very long time. I've worked across the private sector, the consulting sector, intergovernmental and government. And I feel like we've been sitting around for sort of 15, 20 years wondering how we're going to solve this. Because we know simply, we've been talking about, well, climate for a long time, nature in some circles for a long time, in other circles just for a few years. And the challenge is the flow of finance. So some of the things that we can do is we can change how we value the environment. So as I talked about before, it's thinking about what we value. So with the example we saw about the trees and the water earlier, are we just valuing the environment as an input to production, or are we actually valuing it for all of the services that it provides, many of those intrinsic, for example, around health and cultural values? We can also change how we value the environment, as I said before, as companies and businesses and investors start to understand the economic risk they face because of nature, because they put a value on risk and they are willing to invest to mitigate that and manage that risk. And very closely related is my second point of hope, is increasing accountability and disclosure of impacts on nature. So this is something where there is a lot of growing global attention. There has for a few years now been I'm sure many people in the room know, there's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a task force that's come about that's looking at how we can get organisations to start to understand and manage and disclose their risks and impacts on nature. Now, this is good for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because you can't manage what you don't measure. So as companies start to understand these risks, as I've said, that's when they can start to identify mitigation strategies and start to flow some of that finance. Disclosure has a few other helpful benefits as well, though, doesn't it? Because when you start to disclose your impacts and risks on, say, nature, or if we're thinking of the climate parallel, you come under a lot more scrutiny, and that's where you start to see a lot more voluntary action in the corporate and investor space. It also, when you start to disclose, impacts your ability as a business to invest, to attract finance from investors. So increasing accountability and disclosure is a good thing. And third, where I probably have a big job to do, is creating the enabling policy, creating that enabling environment, the regulations, the policies, the incentives that encourage people to be making that positive impact for nature. That can be anything from enabling policy, for example, around the creation of nature markets, or it can be around expectations and things like that to do with requirements to get approvals. But these are some of the things where I think we're starting to see movement, we're starting to see change, and this can help to redirect some of those billions and trillions of dollars that we need to start to solve these crises. It will take all of us. So I guess this applies more broadly than just thinking about nature and climate. Looking across the SDGs more broadly, this is a really big task. There's a lot that we need to do. And whatever sector you play in, you have a role to play. As civil society, you have a role to play. Something I would say, as we're talking about taking all of us, the conversations I had over the break were about how tricky it is to recruit in this market. Because I guess the good thing is climate and nature is finally having its moment, but that means it's very hard to find good people in this space. So I do encourage all of you who are interested or working in this space to understand your value and encourage people to join. And just to end, I think it's very clear we're at a crucial moment. Every choice we make right now matters. Every degree matters. Every year matters. Up on the screen, I've got our lovely friend, the numbat. Sadly, there's actually fewer than 1,000 numbats left in the wild. And we've heard the stats as we've gone through tonight. That's just one of many species in this grim situation. But as I said, this is not about being grim, this is about being hopeful. I am genuinely hopeful that we are at a tipping point. I feel that as we've got to the moment where we've started to really, we're not doing it yet, but we will soon, I think we are starting to understand the value of the environment. And with that, I think we're seeing across the globe, we've got governments, corporates, investors, civil society. This is now on their agenda. So I think with some of the changes we've spoken about tonight, we can start to shift the capital, redirect the finance to help tackle these crises. Thank you.